Okay, so we're on page 225. We're going to be looking at the Second Great Awakening. Now, the in between what's going on here, you've got the American Revolution, and we covered the impact of that through the videos we had from the wall builders. And so when we come up a little bit later on page 228, and it talks about the American Revolution, I'm not going to say as much about that because that was very well covered in the videos. I will bring out some comments in there that are significant, but we want to be considering the church revival movements because now we're going to delve into the church history aspect of things, and part of it was the impact of the American Revolution. So we're going to go back into the church history. So it's talking about the Second Great Awakening, which is 1790. So obviously the American Revolution is all over. What is going to be significant that we want to note at this time is what's called here the period of deterioration. The period of deterioration. And this is extremely important. You have got times of revival that go on. I'd like to wonder, why is it that the times of revival just don't keep going on? I mean, if you get filled with the Spirit and you have a spiritual zeal and you're out there witnessing to people, and you would think, oh, well, finally we've arrived and we've got this energy, and now we're just going to be launched into a Christian golden age. Well, no, this doesn't happen, because what ends up happening is kids get born, okay? And though we went through our struggles, our children don't necessarily. This is one of the significant things about child rearing in church. You know, when Nancy went through, I don't know, Nancy, maybe you might want to talk about this. If you want to raise your hand and go into your experience more, just do that. But Nancy went through an awful time of questioning and wondering and trying to discern and arguing with nuns and with priests in her own way, even as a kid. And she had that spiritual struggle that she went through. And as a result, she asked the hard questions. She got hard answers back to her, given to her. Well, our kids didn't have to go through those struggles. They got the teachings straight from us. When you don't have the struggles to go through, there's a possibility that you're going to take your Christianity and your spirituality for granted to a degree. My thing currently and lately has been talking about people being serious about the Lord, not just being energetic. It's easy to be energetic about the Lord when things are going good and you can be having a wonderful time in church and things like that. When you go through a crisis and you're still going to serve the Lord, that demonstrates your seriousness before God. Let me just a moment there. So you're going to have that seriousness. And kids growing up in church don't exactly have that. One of the things that I know that Nancy and I did, especially as the kids were growing up, is we presented to them the problems of the world so they could see for themselves the stupidity of the world and the struggles that they go through. Of course, we had to do it, you know, as an age-appropriate kind of thing. But it's important for people to have that sense of struggle. This is the purpose why in many of my studies I will go through multiple choice questions, because anybody can parrot back what they read from the reading. And this is why I have the other multiple choice questions at those times, to say, well, what's wrong with this? Because I want there to be a little bit of an intellectual struggle that they have to try to figure things out and to grow by that. So we see this first revivalist movement, and they were doing great, but the next generation comes along, which I'll speak to in a moment. Do we want to call Nancy first? Because I like her better.
When you first started,
She'll kiss me, you won't.
You first started talking about the revivals. Why doesn't it just keep going? I've often wondered, as I look at England,
Yeah.
they had some of the greatest preachers, and if you look at England today, what a mess.
Yeah.
I mean, it's you couldn't even tell that there's anything left of those wonderful days where people were being converted by the thousands.
Yeah.
But it seems to be like a similar thing playing out. I was reminded of the verse in the Old Testament where as things close with Joseph, it says, and there arose a new king who knew not Joseph. Then in Acts, in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, just before Stephen is martyred, he regales everybody with the story of the Jews. And he's just, this is an amazing message. And he says the same thing. The promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. The same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers. And then this next verse really got me. So that they cast out their young children to the end that they might not live. So not only do we have the enemy working feverishly with all the new isms and the cults and the false religions, we're massacring babies in our current age with abortion. And just like that king ordered all the babies to die because he thought the Messiah might be coming, because that's happened a couple of times in the history of the Jews, just murder all the male babies. Moses was spared that, and he became a great Jewish leader, despite all the slaughter of it, because he would have been one of them if his mom didn't hide him. And so we see, unless we diligently teach our children and make sure that they teach their children, the faith gets lost in one generation.
Yes.
People just get away from things and they get sucked right into the world and all of the strange ways of the world. And we can see country after country where this has happened. Particularly it hit me with England because they had Spurgeon, they had Moody, they had all of these wonderful preachers and conversions happening, and yet it just evaporated.
Yeah.
Because one generation to the next.
Yeah. Brother Joe.
Yeah, two things I wanted to point out. What you were saying about Christianity is also true of freedom in general. You know, when people go to war, and like we think of World War II, and that the greatest generation ever. Certainly, those who fought tooth and nail to keep it, they certainly appreciated it. But it's too easy to grow complacent, and the generation that grows up next, having not seen the price that was paid for that, it's just too easy to think, well, it's always been this way and it'll always be this way. But actually, that's definitely not the case. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that although in the West, because we have been a quote-unquote Christian influence, let's say, segment of the world in the West, we've seen the decline of Christianity through the years. But in places like China, where people are struggling just to survive because they're under the iron fist of the communist government, there are underground churches sprouting up everywhere because they have, they
had the struggles.
Right. And also there's a price to be paid if you're found out to be a believer there, or a true believer. They have some state sanctioned churches, but those are watered down. But in the West, because we just see churches everywhere, but people just take it for granted, and each generation gets farther and farther away from God. But in places where they're not allowed to have it, and there's a price to pay, the churches are much stronger because the people there, you're either committed or you're not in.
Yeah, what we see also all around us, we have these people who have escaped communist countries, and they've found their home here in the free West, and they see some of these young people that are chasing off after these pat communist scenarios that seem to work on a simplistic level, not realizing that communism doesn't work, has never worked, Has never ever worked, no matter what. But they're looking at this because they didn't go through the struggles. Well, maybe in New York this November they'll they'll start to go through some of those struggles.
I was just gonna say that, yeah, that would be a disaster if they vote this mayor in, because
Yeah.
he's just gonna chase the whole tax base out of New York, and
Yeah.
it's just gonna become a slum.
They'll figure it out.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, before we get to the actual Second Great Awakening, we want to look at what preceded it, which was the period of deterioration. Now, I'm going to add this in also. Remember we were talking a few weeks ago when we were at the book, we were talking about the old school and the new school movements, and old school Presbyterianism, new school. And one of the things that changed was a more experiential aspect. Now, an experiential aspect can go way too far because people are drawn to sensationalism and the experience. However, there is an importance to about the emphasis on having that Christian experience. The Christian experience, what we mean by that specifically is when you became a Christian, okay? When you asked Christ to be your Savior, that's when you experienced Christ, okay? And you experienced His power because it transformed you and you got saved. Okay, so the old school, it was more intellectual. There's a reason why that would be, okay? Because in those churches where they were getting a revival of true biblical theology, they were burdened by the issue of infant baptism. So you had kids growing up in the church, and we talked about some of the problems that ever came with that, like the halfway covenant we talked about in the past. But you've got kids that are growing up assuming, they assume that they're church members, and other people assume that they're Christian. So being burdened with that infant baptism, which was a deception to them about their Christianity, you had people who didn't even go through the struggle of dealing with their sin in front of God and getting saved. There's just this assumption. So now you've got preachers that had come along, and they're preaching. Well, if you're going to preach the gospel, you're going to preach it to whoever's there. So now you had people starting to have that Christian experience. They were getting saved as adults. They might have been kids that had grown up in church, and now they're finally getting challenged by the gospel. Many times people will come to visit here, and I do not assume that anybody who walks through the door is necessarily a Christian. They might have been in church in the past. That doesn't necessarily make them a Christian. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start making sure I get the gospel into the sermons as well, so people will have a chance to hear that. And when I sit down to talk to somebody, I might see them come in and they don't know how to open the hymnal and how to sing from the hymnal, where they read line after line instead of line one, and then line one on the next stanza, and then on the next stanza line one. And, they don't know how to handle a Bible and things like that. And you start to say, I wonder, okay, is this person necessarily Christian? So in a Baptist church and in other churches like this, you're going to have that challenge. I'm going to talk to somebody. I'm going to ask, well, tell me about how you became a Christian. And 99 times out of 100, they're going to say, well, maybe, and they won't know quite what to say. And I know what it is. They don't know the gospel. Okay, so you did not have that happening in the old school churches. The new school, they are looking for, did you accept Christ as your Savior? And they're not going to accept somebody's infant baptism. Okay, so this aspect of preaching is going to become more popular. Why it's going to become more popular at this time than in other ages, and it existed in all the other ages, that was true. Why it becomes more popular at this age is because you don't have the old state religion imposing itself on people and trying to systematize everything that everybody did and assuming people are Christian. You've got, you don't have the persecution. Now, when you preach, you don't have somebody trying to kill you at the same time. So that's why it's going to grow in popularity. That's what was going to happen in America. So, after the First Great Awakening, you come to the period of deterioration. Reading paragraph 650 and the text after that, after the American Revolution, spirituality faltered before regaining its balance in the Second Great Awakening. So what happened? So let's read here. Formidable innovations and convulsions in Europe threatened destruction to morals and religion. Scenes of devastation and bloodshed unexampled in the history of modern nations have convulsed the world, and our country is threatened with similar calamities. We perceive with pain and fearful apprehension a general dereliction of religious principles and practice among our fellow citizens. And by the way, this is from an author from that time period. A visible and prevailing impiety and contempt for the laws and institutions of religion, and an abounding infidelity, which in many instances tends to atheism itself. The profligacy and corruption of the public morals have advanced with a progress proportionate to our declension in religion. As religion declines, the immorality abounds. Profaneness, pride, luxury, injustice, intemperance, lewdness, and every species of debauchery and loose indulgence greatly abound. And boy, could you say that today in America right now with all the immorality that's been pushed since they started legalizing gay marriage? And so this was written by Bacon in The History of American Christianity. Okay, so now we go on with the quotes. The condition of Yale College before Timothy Dwight took the presidency in 1795 and the school experienced a spiritual awakening was described as follows by a student. Notice this is Yale College. What a lot of people don't know is that, I don't know if it's all the Ivy League schools, but a lot of the Ivy League schools were started for training people for the ministry. And that's exactly not what they're doing today. So the student wrote this. He said, before he came, college was in a most ungodly state. The college church was almost extinct. Most of the students were skeptical, and rowdies were plenty. Wine and liquors were kept in many rooms. Intemperance, profanity, gambling, and licentiousness were common. I hardly know how I escaped. That was the day of the infidelity of the Tom Paine school. Boys that dressed flax in the barn as I used to read Tom Paine and believed him. I read and fought him all the way. Never had any propensity to infidelity, but most of the class before me were infidels and called each other Voltaire, Rousseau, and D'Alembert. Okay, so this is written by Lyman Beecher, and this is his testimony of what Yale had become. America was spreading across the North American continent. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was obtained. Next bullet point, in 1819, Florida was purchased from Spain. In 1845, Texas declared independence from Mexico. In 1846, the Oregon Territory was obtained from Britain. The spirit on the frontiers was that of ungodliness and irreligion. A lawless, irreligious spirit had taken hold on the American frontiers. More than 1 million people flooded to the frontiers of Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Louisiana, and multitudes more pushed farther west, eventually to the Pacific Ocean. The frontier was described as a population transplanted into a wild country under little control, either of conventionality or law, deeply ingrained from many generations with a religious sentiment, but broken loose from the control of it and living consciously in reckless disregard of the law of God. So now David Cloud continues on here. He says, in New England, apostasy and heresy permeated society and deadened the churches. Church historians called it the period of deterioration. Timothy Dwight, who was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards was, a great man of God, and president of Yale University, described the condition in New England after the Revolutionary War as follows: the profanation of the Sabbath, profaning the Sabbath, profaneness of language, drunkenness, gambling, and lewdness were exceedingly increased. And what is less commonly remarked, but is not less mischievous than any of them, a light, vain method of thinking concerning sacred things, a cold, contemptuous indifference toward every moral and religious subject. Focus on that idea of a light, vain method of thinking. And this is something Joe has talked about on occasion as it comes up, that people, whenever they want to challenge Christianity, they ask the same stupid questions all the time. It's like, they read somebody who asked this question, they thought it was really thoughtful, and it's really not. It's vain, it's light, it's amateurish, it is unphilosophical, it is non-intellectual, it's driven by emotion. Can I say more? Joe, did I cover it?
No, you left out the most important part. It's been answered and debunked.
Yes. It's been answered and debunked so many times. This is what they were facing at that time when it says vain and light consideration of things, vain method of thinking. We see this with an awful lot of philosophy. Philosophy depends on presumptuous thinking that they then think they're very smart about, that they conceived of such concepts, and then they build on that, not realizing that their presumptions are really anti-scientific, unreligious, and unphilosophical. Going on, he says Unitarianism, where they believe that there's no Trinity, only one God, and God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and Christ, is talking about only one God manifesting himself in other ways. And humanism were beginning to infiltrate America's churches and popular thinking even before her independence from England. At its foundation, it was an undue exaltation of human intellect and a rejection of the necessity of divine revelation. We're seeing these same forces at play in American politics today. It is the same things are going on. At first, it was incipient. In other words, it was just a little thing. It was a subtle form of Enlightenment philosophy and Scottish common sense. It attempted to reconcile the Bible with man's natural thinking. Its stated goal was to place the Christian faith on an alleged sounder footing by supporting it from the side of man's rational thought. But this was a rejection of the necessity of faith and proved to be the path to apostasy. Okay. Okay. I'm going to stop with that because it's a mouthful to have gone into. The thing that you should get is that, in short, things were a mess. Okay. All this light thinking and the rebellion and people not attending to things, it can happen. It can happen. it's also going to set the stage for the Second Great Awakening. And the reason why the Second Great Awakening can be a more powerful thing is because you've got preachers who are free to preach. What we're going to see in a couple of pages later, what we're going to see is that the old school churches, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, are going to drop back. The Methodists and the Baptists will push forward because though I have some disagreement with Methodists, they were ones who were looking for a more real experience also, as well as the Baptists did. And so that's why they are going to explode on the scene. Brother Joe. And then others, you might have comments or questions.
I was just going to say that the Methodists and the Baptists were at the forefront of evangelization.
Yes.
The other churches, probably because of their Calvinism, were waiting for God to bring them in, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we baptize them so they're going to grow into the church or something. Yeah, we might be more familiar with liberal Methodist churches like the United Methodist churches and things like that, where it's a mess of apostasy that goes on. But in some places, the Methodists are supposed to not be very different from the Baptists within the Baptist fundamentalists. Other thoughts? Yeah, Brother Tone.
The Bible is replete with examples of apostasy, and it's a cycle.
Yeah.
In fact, King Solomon said in his book Ecclesiastes that there is nothing new under the sun. So
Yeah.
it says, but he made the conclusion as a solution to all the repetitive cycles. The only solution is fear God, which is the point in the book of Judges, where every time they didn't have a king, they had only God calls a judge whenever they are in trouble and they needed an answer. But then at the end of the book of Judges, it says there,
I got it here.
yeah,
In those days, there was no king in Israel.
correct.
Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. I was with you on this one. Yeah, yeah.
And then
after the period of growing and deteriorating, yeah.
And then at the end of Samuel, people started to follow their neighbors in their thinking, and they wanted a king.
Yeah.
And he was complaining to God that why should they desire a king when they have already a king,
Yeah.
which is Jehovah God. And God said, in His permissive, because He knew what's going to happen next. He said that it's okay. You just go ahead and choose a king. And the first thing that Samuel was looking at a king is that he is heads and shoulders above everybody else. That's a physical feature, Pastor.
Yeah.
And until they found out that Saul was a failure and they had to choose somebody, Samuel again had to choose somebody who is after God's own heart, and that was King David.
Yeah.
But after David, it's another issue again, where he had all the wisdom in the world.
Well, you can only take the types so far.
Yes.
Okay, but if you go from Saul to David, and thinking about it politically, yeah, they wanted the king, because every man did that which was right in his own sight, and they got what they were looking for, their kind. So it's like God set them up, and then the type would be completed in David. Like, okay, this is what you really want, and that's kind of like what we have in the world today. People looking for a king,
correct, Pastor. And
but what they need is Jesus Christ. And the
that's why
millennial kingdom.
in our founders were really having sought God's wisdom. They really made sure. I'm cutting short the historical portion, Pastor. They had the wisdom to what's the first Bill of Rights? The First Amendment.
Yeah.
And it includes most especially the freedom of religion.
Yeah.
And then because if this is violated, there comes the solution, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and then because it's always consider that if you infringe upon freedom is not from government, it's from God. That's a recognition in the Declaration of Independence and repeated in the preamble. We the people. So if you forget this, for example, in New York, we forget that they thought that government would be the answer to. That's why this Mandami guy has an appeal. He's young,
Yeah.
and a lot of energy, but he has the wrong ideas, and yet they seem to at this point in time, New York, majority of New Yorkers believe that that they want him because it's free everything, and then
They'll figure it out.
yeah, but what is surprising, Pastor, is that God's chosen people remains quiet. Then they're the ones being attacked also.
Yeah.
The Greek population in New York is very big. If they would in a single heart and mind vote for something more prudent and less radical than communism,
Yeah.
we would be able to save New York. but I used to tell Christy, you should be aggressive in your church there in Manhattan. That's where the United Nations is located. That's the seat of Satan in New York.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have a big evangelical problem in New York, and you have to have your member. The trouble with their membership, Pastor, is that they come and go. They're like many visitors from other countries who are Baptists. They join them, and then like that. So they have a core group, but there are few. So hopefully the few will be magnificent 7.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Let's go ahead and pray with that, and we'll go take the Baptist nap.